In drag show news, Florida is facing this issue as there's been a lawsuit filed by a restaurant that would like to do the drag shows. So there's been an issue on the drag shows as it relates to kids, as it relates to generally, and we get into these conflicts as it relates to the First Amendment. Now, what is notable, of course, is as it relates to prurient kinds of performances, one that involves an appeal to our baser instincts, the state has long had the ability to regulate shops and places that appeal to these instincts, particularly as they appeal to them in greater and more overt ways. So particular kinds of businesses that appeal to these base desires can be regulated as to who can come into them, where they can be, what hours they can operate, and so forth and so on. So we get into this sort of question as it relates to a drag show. You know, what sort of part of the continuum are we on that issue? As it relates to this, can we ban them outright? Can we regulate where they're occurred in parts of town? Can we regulate their times? Can we regulate the ages of the people? We get into these kinds of questions as it relates to these more base instinct, potentially appealing entertainment shows. So how does that relate to this Florida law? Let's get started with this. A popular Orlando restaurant that features drag shows filed a lawsuit against Florida less than a week after Florida signed a bill that targets the drag performances. So, you know, bringing that conflict right to a head. Florida passes law that deals with the drag performances. Is this lawful? Could be, maybe, depends on the details. We'll see. The lawsuit filed in Orlando court by the owners of Hamburger Mary's claims the state is depriving its First Amendment right of free expression, which, you know, is obviously the issue at hand. And our ability to regulate that expression, of course, depends on the details. Time, place, manner, for example, is it, and as it appeals to things that might reach towards and potentially actually meet the potentially obscene, the state's ability to regulate that within a First Amendment context becomes more and more justified. So that is sort of the issue that's in play. DeSantis made the legislation a part of his agenda. He signed the bill restricting the drag performances, along with bills that ban gender-affirming care, which gets into the ability of states to regulate medicine, in which they have broad authority in general, of course. Restrict discussions of personal pronouns in schools, which to the extent we are doing that to our teachers is probably lawful because they are state employees and we're regulating ourselves. And force people to use certain bathrooms, which again raises a bunch of legal issues. So there are a whole bunch of issues here that they are doing. Some of this may be lawful. Some of it may not be lawful. It depends on the details. It depends on how expansive what they're doing is. It depends who the law applies to. If it applies to the government or governmental employees, probably lawful. If it applies to private citizens, more concerning. As it relates to charged speech that relates to baser instincts, the more that it appeals to that, the more it can be regulated. So, like many things, it depends on the details. Hamburger Mary's Bar and Grill has a dozen locations in the United States. According to the lawsuit, they hosted a family-friendly drag show. And incidentally, and not for nothing, I have seen, as I'm sure many of you have seen, some TikToks from shows that were advertised as family-friendly. And in many cases, I would have to respectfully dispute the label, assuming that there is such a thing as a family-friendly drag show, assuming that exists in principle. Many of the shows I have seen have been somewhat provocative and question that label. So yeah, this Florida law would force them to ban children from the showings, which again, possibly is legal. Because again, we're thinking about this as it might apply to other charged performances in other kinds of industries and shops and bars and clubs that appeal to those kinds of things. So can we ban the under 18-year-olds? Sure, we can. We do it all the time. Can we ban the children from these kinds of shows? Maybe. Maybe we can. Maybe that's the same thing. Is that the same thing? Is it a different thing? How family friendly are these shows? The First Amendment details are questionable. Proponents of the legislation say the law is meant to keep children from viewing the explicit performances, which, we do as a matter of law in other domains. So there's that. Lawyers for the business argue the law is so broad, it could apply to almost any performance that involves a man dressing up like a woman, even if the performance isn't base in its nature. So maybe, but then again, maybe that's an as-applied challenge on the details as opposed to a facial challenge. So maybe the lawsuit says business owners can't risk having their licenses suspended or risk the criminal prosecution for, the treatment of minors, which, is often a problem when you have dereliction of a minor and promoting the dereliction of a minor. Yeah, that raises a problem. So they'd like to have the drag shows, and they're not allowed to have the drag shows, and they're not allowed to have men dress up like women, even if they're not appealing to base instincts. So, okay. Thus, that brings us to the end of the coverage of this place that serves hamburgers, which also wants to do drag shows. I'm not quite sure how hamburgers and drag shows necessarily go to each other, but that's what they'd like to do. The state of Florida says not so much as it relates to the children, and they have filed a lawsuit claiming First Amendment protection. So this is going to depend a lot on the details, of course. It will depend on the nature of the law and how it's written as we're thinking about a facial challenge, and also thinking about exactly what this restaurant wants to do as we're thinking about a facial challenge. But of course, as we appeal more and more to the baser instincts of humanity, we know that we can regulate that because we do that for certain clubs and certain stores that specialize in that domain, where we can regulate where their businesses are located. We can regulate who they let in the door. We can regulate how they're conducted, and so forth and so on. So where on the continuum are we as it relates to this is not immediately clear. But Florida is trying to do this. We'll see how it all pans out. And that, for the moment, brings us to the end of discussion of this case.